Let's start with the most basic tool every human ancestor had: their own senses. Long before language, long before fire, our early ancestors were already primates, and primates are exceptionally good at one very specific skill: judging food by taste, smell, and texture. This is not a coincidence, it is evolution, doing what evolution does best: keeping the organisms that make good choices alive long enough to reproduce, and letting the ones that make bad choices die out. Bitterness is the big one here. Across the plant kingdom, bitterness is very often a chemical warning sign. Plants cannot run away from the animals that want to eat them, so many of them evolved chemical defenses instead: alkaloids, tannins, glycosides, and other compounds that taste unpleasant and can be toxic in enough quantity. Humans, like most primates, are born with a strong innate aversion to bitter tastes. Watch a baby taste something bitter for the first time. They do not need to be taught to scrunch up their face and spit it out. That reaction is ancient. It is a built-in early warning system inherited from millions of years of primate evolution, and it was one of the very first filters our ancestors had for figuring out what not to eat. Sourness worked in a similar way, often signalling unripe fruit or fermentation, both of which could cause stomach trouble. Sweetness, on the other hand, was a green light. Sweet almost always meant ripe fruit, meant sugar, meant safe calories, and our brains reward us for eating sweet things with a dopamine hit, which is exactly why we still crave sugar today, even though we no longer need to forage for berries in a forest. Smell mattered just as much. A rotten, sulphurous or acrid smell triggers disgust in humans almost universally, and disgust is one of our oldest and most powerful emotional systems. Researchers who study disgust believe it evolved specifically as a behavioral immune system, a way of avoiding pathogens, parasites, and toxins before you even put something in your mouth. If a plant smelled like decay, like rot, like something had gone chemically wrong with it, ancient humans avoided it almost automatically. This was not conscious reasoning, it was gut instinct, quite literally. But instinct alone could not have gotten our ancestors all the way there. Instinct is a blunt tool. It can tell you this tastes bad, be careful, but it cannot tell you the root of this plant is fine to eat, but the leaves will kill you, or this plant is deadly raw, but perfectly safe once you boil it 3 times. That kind of precision required something more powerful than instinct. It required learning, and one of the very first teachers our ancestors had was not another human at all. It was the animal world around them. Early humans were relentless observers of animals, and for good reason. Animals that had been eating certain plants for millions of years longer than humans had been around were walking, breathing test subjects. If a troop of monkeys ate a particular fruit and thrived, that fruit was probably safe for humans too, since humans and many primates share a lot of similar digestive chemistry. If birds gorged themselves on certain berries, humans took note. If deer, goats, or other herbivores grazed heavily on a plant without dropping dead, that was valuable information. This observation went both ways, though, and this is where it gets more interesting. Not everything an animal could eat was safe for a human. Birds, for example, can safely eat many berries that are toxic to mammals because their digestive systems process certain toxins completely differently. So ancient people were not just copying animals blindly. They were building a more layered understanding, noticing which animals shared their same vulnerabilities and which ones did not. Over generations, this became an intuitive but genuinely accurate science of comparative physiology, long before anyone had a word for physiology at all. Even today, anthropologists who study foragers, people like the Hadza in Tanzania or the San in the Kalahari, have documented this exact behavior. These communities can point to specific plants and explain in detail which animals eat them, which parts are used, and what happens if a human eats it the wrong way. This knowledge did not appear overnight. It represents an unbroken chain of testing and observation stretching back further than anyone can precisely date, which brings us to the harder, riskier part of the story: direct trial and error. Because at some point someone has to be the first person to eat something new. And in the earliest days of human plant knowledge, that first attempt could kill you. This is not a hypothetical. Anthropologists and ethnobotanists studying isolated and traditional societies have found extensive evidence that this trial and error process was often systematic rather than reckless. There are documented practices from multiple cultures around the world where a small amount of an unfamiliar plant would be tasted first sometimes just touched to the lips or tongue, and the person would wait, watching for a tingling sensation, numbness, or burning. If nothing happened after a short time, a slightly larger amount might be tried. This is essentially the same core logic behind modern toxicology testing, dose-response evaluation, just done by real people on themselves with no lab equipment over the course of days or weeks instead of a controlled clinical trial. It is almost certain that many people died from this process. That is an uncomfortable thing to sit with, but it is true and it matters because it tells us something important. The vast and detailed plant knowledge that ancient and traditional societies carry was not free. It was paid for, sometimes with human lives, over an enormous span of time. Every single deadly plant that gets passed down through generations as never eat this represents, in some cases, a real person in a real moment who found out the hard way. That knowledge was too valuable and too hard won to be lost, and so cultures developed powerful ways to make sure it never had to be relearned the same painful way twice. This is where storytelling, myth, taboo, and ritual come in, and this might be one of the most underappreciated parts of the whole story. Human beings are exceptional at transmitting information through narrative. A plain fact like the seeds of this plant are dangerous is easy to forget, especially across generations who might rarely encounter that particular plant, but wrap that same fact inside a story. A warning from an ancestor spirit, a taboo tied to a specific place or season, a myth about a trickster figure who was punished for eating a certain fruit, and suddenly that information becomes memorable, emotionally charged, and far more likely to survive being passed down accurately for hundreds or even thousands of years. Anthropologists have found that many food taboos across traditional cultures, taboos that outsiders once dismissed as superstition, actually correspond remarkably well with genuine biological hazards. A plant considered cursed or forbidden in local folklore very often turns out, on later chemical analysis, to contain real toxins, especially in certain seasons, certain growth stages, or certain preparations. The taboo was not irrational. It was a form of compressed data, wrapped in cultural language, because cultural language is what survives. This is also where elders became absolutely critical to human survival, and it is one of the strongest arguments researchers give for why humans evolved such unusually long lifespans after reproduction compared to other primates. A grandmother who remembers a famine 40 years earlier and remembers exactly which unusual plants kept the group alive during that famine and which ones made people sick is not just a nice thing to have around. She is a living, walking survival archive. Some researchers who study human longevity refer to this as the grandmother hypothesis. The idea that long post-reproductive lifespans evolved partly because older individuals, freed from the demands of raising their own young, could pass down decades or generations of accumulated ecological knowledge to their grandchildren. Now let's talk about preparation, because this is one of the most genuinely impressive parts of ancient plant knowledge. It's something that could never have come from instinct or observation alone. It had to come from careful, repeated, intentional experimentation. Many plants that are lethal in their raw form become perfectly edible, even nutritious, once processed correctly. Cassava is one of the most famous examples in the world today. Bitter cassava, a staple crop for hundreds of millions of people, contains compounds that release cyanide when the plant is damaged. Eaten raw in sufficient quantity, it can cause serious poisoning or death, and yet across parts of Africa and South America, people develop detailed multi-step processes to make it safe. Peeling it, soaking it in water for days, grating it, pressing out the toxic liquid and then fermenting or cooking what remained. This is not a simple discovery. It is a precise multi-stage engineering process, refined and repeated over countless generations, that neutralizes a genuine poison and turns it into one of the most important food crops on the planet. Similar stories show up again and again around the world. Acorns, a major food source for many indigenous peoples in North America, contain bitter tannins that need to be leached out through repeated soaking or boiling in water before they become palatable and digestible. Certain wild yams, taro root, and various other tubers require careful cooking, sometimes multiple rounds of boiling with the water discarded each time to remove toxic compounds. Elderberries are toxic raw but safe once properly cooked. In every one of these cases, someone, or more likely, many someones over a long stretch of time, had to notice a pattern. This plant hurts us when eaten this way, but if we do this other thing to it first, it does not. That is not guesswork. That is applied chemistry, discovered empirically, without any concept of chemistry as a formal field, purely through careful observation and repetition. And once one household or one small group figured out that process, it did not stay isolated, it spread. This is one of the true superpowers of humans as a species, our capacity for cumulative culture. Unlike almost any other animal, humans can take an individual discovery and, through language, teaching, and imitation, make it a permanent part of the group's shared knowledge, refined further by each new person who uses it. A single person figuring out that cassava needs to be soaked for 3 days does not just save that one person. It can save an entire lineage of descendants, an entire village, and eventually, passed along trade routes and through migration, entire regions of the world. There is also a fascinating layer to this story involving what scientists sometimes call self-medication behavior, and it connects humans back to the animal kingdom in a really interesting way. Researchers studying primates, particularly chimpanzees, have observed them seeking out specific plants that are not part of their normal diet and eating them in ways that seem deliberately medicinal, swallowing certain rough leaves whole to help expel intestinal parasites, or chewing on particular bitter plants that have anti-parasitic properties, seemingly when they are sick rather than as a regular food source. This behavior, sometimes called zoopharmacognosy, suggests that the instinct to use plants medicinally, not just nutritionally, may be extremely old in our evolutionary line, older than humans themselves. Our ancestors likely brought a version of this instinct with them, and it, combined with careful cultural observation over time, became the foundation of traditional medicine systems that use specific plants for pain relief, wound treatment, fever, digestive trouble, and childbirth, systems of knowledge so detailed that a huge percentage of modern pharmaceutical compounds were originally identified by researchers studying traditional plant medicine. Aspirin has roots in willow bark, long used by various ancient cultures for pain and fever. Quinine, one of history's most important treatments for malaria, comes from the bark of the cinchona tree, first used medicinally by indigenous peoples in South America long before European colonizers learned about it and brought it back across the Atlantic. These are not isolated flukes. They are the modern scientific world essentially rediscovering and chemically confirming things that traditional plant knowledge had already established through generations of careful, embodied experimentation. It's also worth talking about how migration and environmental change tested this knowledge system constantly and forced it to keep evolving as human groups moved into new regions, whether through slow migration or over generations or sudden environmental shifts. They encountered plants they had never seen before, plants with no accumulated cultural knowledge attached to them at all. This meant that the entire process, instinctive tasting, careful observation of animals, cautious trial and error, had to start again in miniature every single time. This is part of why humans developed such a broadly applicable set of tools and heuristics, rather than just a fixed list of safe plants, memorized like a shopping list. The bitterness aversion, the disgust response to rot, the careful small-dose testing method, the watching of animal behavior, all of these were general strategies adaptable to any environment rather than knowledge tied to one specific place. That flexibility is arguably the single biggest reason humans were able to successfully populate nearly every biome on Earth, from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest to arid desert, each with an entirely different set of plants, and in every single one of those environments, humans eventually built accurate, detailed, life-sustaining plant knowledge from scratch. There is one more piece of this puzzle that deserves attention, and it is easy to overlook: pattern recognition across plant families. Ancient people were not just memorizing individual plants one at a time like flashcards. Over time, they began to notice broader patterns that plants with certain shared characteristics, milky white sap, for instance, or particular leaf shapes or certain smells, tended to belong to families that were more likely to be toxic. This is not unlike how modern botanists use plant families to make educated predictions about a newly discovered species before it has even been chemically tested. Ancient foragers were essentially doing early taxonomic thinking, sorting the plant world into broader categories of risk based on shared traits, which allowed them to approach a completely unfamiliar plant with a reasonable starting guess about how cautious to be, rather than facing every new plant as a total unknown. Put all of these pieces together, the innate taste and smell instincts inherited from our primate ancestors, the careful observation of which animals ate what, the disciplined and often dangerous process of small-scale trial and error, the cultural transmission of that knowledge through story, myth, taboo, and the wisdom of elders, the sophisticated multi-step preparation techniques that could turn poison into food, the deep instinct towards self-medication inherited from even further back in our evolutionary history, and the broader pattern recognition applied to entire plant families, and you start to see the real answer to the question. Ancient humans did not know which plants were safe because of a single clever trick or a lucky guess, or blind superstition. They knew because they built piece by piece, generation after generation, one of the most sophisticated empirical knowledge systems in the history of our species, tested constantly against the highest possible stakes, life and death, and refined endlessly through culture, memory, and careful teaching. It is humbling, honestly, to think about how much of what we now call science, controlled testing, dose-response observation, comparative analysis, pattern-based classification, was already being practiced by our ancestors, without laboratories, without written records for most of that history, purely through patient, careful, embodied experience passed from one generation to the next. And it is worth remembering that this knowledge is not entirely gone. It still lives on in traditional and indigenous communities around the world today, and the elders who can walk through a forest and name every plant, explain what it is used for, and tell you exactly how to prepare it safely. In many places, that knowledge is fragile now, threatened by displacement, by younger generations moving to cities, by the simple fact that this kind of understanding was never written in a book. It was written in memory, in practice, and in the relationships between people and the land they lived on. So the next time you walk past a wild plant, a berry bush, a patch of unfamiliar greenery, take a moment to consider what it actually took for humans to be able to look at a plant like that and know with real confidence whether it would nourish you or kill you. It took instinct sharpened over millions of years. It took careful, patient observation of the natural world. It took real courage and sometimes real sacrifice from people willing to test the unknown so that others would not have to. And it took an extraordinary human gift, the ability to remember to teach and to pass wisdom forward so that no single person ever had to learn the hardest lessons alone. There is also a timing dimension to all of this that rarely gets enough credit: seasonal and developmental knowledge. Many plants are not simply safe or unsafe in some fixed, permanent sense. Their chemistry changes depending on the time of year, the stage of growth, and even the part of the plant in question. A root might be perfectly edible in early spring before it flowers, and mildly toxic later in the season once the plant redirects its chemical energy into defending its seeds. Unripe fruit is very often more toxic or simply more likely to cause digestive distress than the same fruit once fully ripened. Leaves picked young and tender might be fine, while the same leaves picked old and tough might contain concentrated levels of defensive compounds. Ancient foragers tracked all of this with remarkable precision, building what was essentially a seasonal calendar layered on top of their plant knowledge, knowing not just what to eat, but exactly when and exactly which part. This required years, sometimes a lifetime, of paying close attention to the same patch of land through every season, watching how it changed and remembering what happened the last time a particular plant was eaten at a particular stage. Mushrooms deserve a special mention here too, because they represent perhaps the most dangerous category of all in the plant and fungi world, and one where the margin for error is often brutally small. Unlike many toxic plants, which tend to announce themselves through bitterness or a foul smell, some of the deadliest mushrooms taste mild, even pleasant, and give no obvious warning sign until symptoms appear hours or even days later. by which point it can be too late to do anything about it. This made fungi one of the hardest categories of food to learn safely through simple trial and error, since the feedback loop that worked reasonably well for many plants, taste something, notice a reaction quickly, learn from it, simply did not apply in the same way. Traditional societies that relied on wild mushrooms as a food source developed extraordinarily specific identification knowledge as a result, focused heavily on visual detail, precise habitat, the specific tree species a mushroom grew near, spore colour and other subtle markers, because taste alone could not be trusted to reveal the danger in time. This is a powerful reminder that ancient plant knowledge was not one single method applied uniformly everywhere. It was a flexible toolkit, and different categories of organisms demanded entirely different strategies, refined specifically to match how dangerous and how deceptive that category of food could be. It is also worth pointing out how this knowledge functioned as a form of social insurance. In small, tightly connected communities, the survival of any one person's hard-won discovery depended entirely on it being shared. A person who learned painfully that a certain root needed 3 days of soaking rather than one had every incentive to tell everyone around them, because in these communities, individual survival and group survival were deeply intertwined. This is very different from a purely individualistic model of learning, where knowledge might be hoarded or lost with the person who discovered it. Instead, human plant knowledge functioned more like a shared, constantly updated library, maintained collectively, corrected collectively, and defended fiercely against being forgotten, because forgetting it could cost lives the very next season. That, in the end, is how ancient humans knew which plants were safe, not through magic and not through luck, but through one of the oldest and most remarkable forms of science humanity has ever practiced. If you will like to see more videos like this, kindly support by clicking the subscribe button. Like this video and drop your honest opinion in the comment. Do you think ancient humans were more smarter in discovering than our modern generation? Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next one.